The door frightened them more than the ocean had. Oklahoma, March 1945. The wind moved across the flat prairie in long, quiet waves, carrying the scent of dry grass and red dirt through the military camp. The journey across the Atlantic was over. The train ride through America was over. Yet for 17 German women standing in a narrow corridor inside Camp Rose, fear had not loosened its grip. It had only changed shape. Elsa Richter stood at the front of the group. She was 29 years old, a former nurse from Bremen, and she had learned long ago that panic spread faster than disease. That was why she kept her shoulders straight even now. That was why she refused to let her hands shake. Behind her, other women clutched small canvas bags containing the few possessions they still owned. A photograph. A hairbrush. A folded letter. Tiny pieces of lives that no longer existed. The corridor stretched ahead beneath rows of yellow ceiling lights. The bulbs hummed softly. Somewhere outside, a truck engine rumbled and faded into the distance. The camp felt strangely calm. Too calm. Elsa did not trust calm anymore. War had taught her that silence often arrived just before something terrible. A wooden sign hung above the door at the end of the hall. One simple word painted in white letters. Showers. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The women stared at the sign as if it were a warning. As if it contained a secret message only they could understand. Elsa heard someone behind her whisper a prayer. Another woman quietly began to cry. The sound was small. Barely audible. Yet it seemed to echo through the hallway. 3 weeks earlier, while crowded aboard a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, they had listened to stories repeated over and over again. Stories passed between frightened prisoners in dark sleeping compartments. Stories that grew larger each time they were told. America would humiliate them. America would punish them. America would make examples of them. The details changed depending on who was speaking. The fear never changed. Elsa had never fully believed those stories. Not completely. But belief was not required for fear to survive. Fear only needed uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. The ship had been crowded with rumors. Every day someone claimed to know what waited on the other side of the ocean. Every day another prediction appeared. Every day another nightmare was shared. By the time they reached American soil, even the most rational women carried questions they could not answer. Now they stood in front of a wooden door with a sign above it and felt every one of those questions return at once. Elsa studied the grain of the wood. It looked ordinary. The brass handle looked ordinary. Everything about the door seemed ordinary. Somehow that made it worse. Extraordinary dangers could be recognized. Ordinary dangers could hide in plain sight. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor. The women stiffened immediately. A tall American sergeant appeared beneath the ceiling lights. He carried a clipboard under one arm. His uniform was pressed neatly despite the long day. His name tag read Thomas Miller. Elsa had seen him several times since arriving at Camp Rose. He spoke little. He never shouted. He simply performed his duties with the calm efficiency of a man following routine. To the prisoners, that made him difficult to read. Sergeant Miller stopped several feet away. He glanced at the clipboard, then at the women. For a moment nobody spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the electric lights. "Ladies," he finally said, his voice steady and professional. "You'll be processed shortly. First, showers." The words landed like stones. Several women exchanged nervous looks. One lowered her eyes immediately. Another tightened her grip on her canvas bag. Elsa felt her pulse quicken despite herself. Miller appeared unaware of the effect. Or perhaps he understood and chose not to acknowledge it. Either way, he continued. "Clean towels are inside. Fresh clothing will be issued afterward. Fresh clothing. Clean towels." The words sounded almost absurd after months of war. Yet nobody seemed reassured. The sergeant gave a brief nod and stepped aside. You may proceed when ready. When ready. Elsa nearly laughed at the phrase. Ready was impossible. She remembered the last real shower she had taken. It had been nearly a year earlier in a field hospital before everything began collapsing. Since then there had been buckets, basins, rivers, rainwater collected in metal containers. Nothing that resembled normal life. Nothing that resembled peace. Behind her, a young woman named Lotte whispered, "What if this is where it starts?" Elsa turned slightly. Lotte looked no older than 20. Her face was pale from exhaustion. "We don't know that," Elsa said quietly. "We don't know anything." It was not a comforting answer. It was simply the truth. And truth mattered more than comfort now. The corridor grew silent again. Outside, somewhere beyond the camp buildings, a train whistle sounded across the Oklahoma plains. Long and distant. Elsa listened to it fade into the evening air. For a brief moment she imagined home. Not the Germany she had left behind. Not the Germany consumed by war. The older Germany. The one that existed before uniforms and propaganda and endless fear. The Germany of bakeries opening at dawn. Church bells on Sunday mornings. Families gathering around dinner tables. Small ordinary moments. The kind that disappeared first when history decided to become loud. She wondered if those moments would ever return. Then she looked at the door again. Showers. A simple word. A simple room. Yet 17 women stood frozen before it because fear had spent years teaching them what to expect. And fear was not easily dismissed. It lingered. It waited. It whispered. Elsa drew a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of soap. That surprised her. Soap. Such an ordinary scent. Such an ordinary detail. Somehow it felt more powerful than any speech. She took one step forward. Then another. The wooden floor creaked beneath her shoes. Behind her, the others remained motionless. Watching. Waiting. Hoping she was right. Hoping they were all wrong about what waited beyond the door. Elsa stopped 3 feet from the door. The brass handle reflected the yellow light above, dull and worn from years of use. Nothing about it appeared threatening. Nothing about it explained why her heart was beating so hard. Behind her, the corridor remained silent. 17 women waited for someone else to decide what happened next. Elsa understood that feeling. She had spent enough time in hospitals to recognize it. Patients often looked to the calmest person in the room when fear became too large to carry alone. Whether that calm was real hardly mattered. She reached forward and wrapped her fingers around the handle. The metal felt cool against her skin. For a moment she simply stood there. Then she turned it. The door opened inward with a soft click. Warm air drifted into the hallway immediately. Not smoke. Not chemicals. Steam. Elsa blinked. Beyond the doorway stretched a clean room lined with white tile. Rows of shower heads extended along the walls. Wooden benches sat neatly arranged in the center. Stacks of folded towels rested on shelves. Everything looked ordinary. Almost painfully ordinary. The room reminded her of a public bathhouse she had visited as a child before the world had become obsessed with uniforms and flags. Nobody inside shouted. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody even seemed aware they were standing there. At the far end of the room, a woman in an American uniform was arranging supplies on a countertop. She looked up when the door opened. Her expression remained neutral. Professional. Calm. She appeared to be somewhere in her early 30s. Her dark hair was tucked neatly beneath her cap. She carried a bundle of fresh towels in her arms. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was gentle but direct. "I am Corporal Helen Walker." The women remained frozen. Helen seemed unsurprised by their hesitation. She set the towels down and walked toward one of the shower stations. Without saying another word, she turned a metal handle. Water immediately poured from the fixture above. Clear water. Steam rising into the air. The sound filled the room with a steady rushing rhythm. Helen placed a folded towel on a nearby bench. Then she set down a wrapped bar of soap beside it. She stepped back. "You may take your time," she said. "Nobody will disturb you." Elsa studied her carefully. The corporal's posture carried none of the superiority she had expected from a captor. She looked more like a schoolteacher preparing a classroom than a soldier overseeing prisoners. That realization confused Elsa more than anything else. Fear was easier to process than kindness. Kindness demanded questions. Behind Elsa, Lotte appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she looked around. "That is all," she whispered in German. Elsa did not answer. She was asking herself the same question. Helen glanced toward them again. "Fresh uniforms will be waiting outside afterward," she said. "If anyone needs medical assistance, please tell me." Medical assistance. Another ordinary phrase. Another small detail that refused to fit the stories they had carried across the ocean. Helen gave a short nod and walked toward the exit on the opposite side of the room. She opened the door. Before leaving, she paused. "You will have privacy," she said simply. Then she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The room fell quiet except for the sound of running water. Nobody moved. Elsa stared at the closed door. Privacy. The word echoed in her thoughts. For months, privacy had barely existed. Crowded ships. Processing centers. Long train rides. Endless waiting among strangers. Even fear had become public. Yet here was an American corporal offering something as simple and as valuable as a closed door. Lotte approached one of the benches slowly. She touched a folded towel with the tips of her fingers. "It is clean," she said. Another woman picked up a wrapped bar of soap. The paper was bright and new. She turned it over in her hands as if examining an artifact. Elsa walked farther into the room. The floor beneath her shoes was spotless. Steam drifted gently through the air. She stopped beside one of the shower stations and looked upward. Water continued falling into the drain below. Such a simple thing. Yet she realized she had not seen water flow so freely in a very long time. During the final months of the war, entire neighborhoods had struggled for basic necessities. People saved every drop. Here, clean water rushed endlessly from metal pipes without anyone counting it. Without anyone guarding it. The realization settled quietly into her thoughts. Another crack forming in the picture she had carried of America. Around her, the women slowly began setting down their bags. Fear had not vanished. It remained present in every cautious movement. But something else was beginning to appear beside it. Curiosity. Uncertainty. Hope, perhaps. Small and fragile. Elsa reached toward the stream of water. A few drops splashed against her fingers. Warm. She closed her eyes briefly. Warm water. Not cold rain. Not a bucket. Not a basin carried across a crowded camp. Warm water flowing from a wall in the middle of Oklahoma. She opened her eyes again and looked toward the closed door where Corporal Walker had disappeared. Then she looked at the rows of towels waiting on the benches. For the first time since arriving in America, Elsa felt something unexpected. Not trust. Trust would take longer. But the possibility of trust. And sometimes that possibility was enough to change the direction of a person's thoughts forever. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The sound of water filled the room, steady and unhurried, as if the building itself was breathing. Elsa looked around at the other women. Some still stood near the doorway. Others had taken cautious steps toward the benches. No one seemed quite certain what came next. The uncertainty felt strange. For years, orders had dictated every hour. Every action. Every expectation. Now they had been given something unfamiliar. A choice. Latte was the first to set down her canvas bag. The small bundle landed softly on the wooden bench. She looked toward Elsa, searching for reassurance. Elsa offered a slight nod. It was enough. One by one, the others followed. Bags were placed carefully beside folded towels. The room remained quiet except for the gentle rush of warm water. Elsa picked up one of the bars of soap. The wrapper was cream-colored with blue lettering. She turned it over in her hands. It smelled faintly of lavender. The scent caught her off guard. For a moment she was no longer standing in Oklahoma. She was 16 years old again, helping her mother hang laundry behind their apartment building on a bright spring afternoon. The memory appeared suddenly and completely. The smell of clean fabric. The distant ringing of bicycle bells. Neighbors talking across. Open windows. Ordinary life. A life that now felt impossibly far away. Elsa closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she realized several of the women were staring at their own bars of soap with similar expressions. They were not looking at soap. They were looking at memories. Small pieces of the world they had lost. One woman quietly laughed. The sound surprised everyone, including herself. It was not a loud laugh. More a startled breath escaping her chest. Another woman smiled for the first time since arriving at the camp. The change was almost invisible. Yet Elsa noticed it immediately. Fear was beginning to lose territory. Slowly. Reluctantly. But undeniably. She walked toward one of the shower stations and set the soap on the narrow shelf beneath it. Warm water continued flowing into the drain below. She reached forward and let it run across her hands. The sensation felt almost unreal. Not because the water was extraordinary. Because it was ordinary. During the war, simple comforts had become rare enough to feel luxurious. A warm room. A clean blanket. A fresh loaf of bread. A letter arriving from home. The things people once ignored had become treasures. Around her, the women gradually relaxed. Conversations began in low voices. Not fearful whispers anymore. Actual conversations. Someone commented on the towels. Another wondered how long the camp had been operating. A third speculated about what kind of work they might be assigned in the coming weeks. The room felt different now. Not safe exactly. Safety was still a distant concept. But no longer threatening. Elsa heard the door open behind her. Several women turned immediately. Corporal Helen Walker stepped inside carrying another stack of folded clothing. She paused when she noticed the change in atmosphere. The tension had not vanished, but it had softened. Helen placed the clothing neatly on a bench. "There are enough uniforms for everyone," she said. "If something does not fit, we can find another size." Elsa studied her again. The corporal spoke with the practical tone of someone solving everyday problems. There was no performance in it. No attempt to impress anyone. Just simple competence. Helen noticed Elsa watching her. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Elsa hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes. The answer surprised her. It was the truth. Helen smiled politely. Good. She started toward the door again. Before leaving, she stopped. The mess hall opens at 6 tomorrow morning. Breakfast is served until 7. Breakfast. Another ordinary word. Another reminder that life inside the camp appeared governed by schedules rather than fear. After Helen left, Elsa found herself thinking about Sergeant Miller. The American had spoken very little since their arrival. Yet his actions had followed the same pattern. No threats. No cruelty. No attempts to humiliate anyone. Only procedures. Rules. Routine. It was not warmth. But it was fairness. And fairness was something she understood. A few minutes later, Elsa finally stepped fully beneath the stream of water. Warmth settled across her skin. She stood perfectly still. The sensation was so unfamiliar that she almost laughed. Months of dust, travel, exhaustion, and uncertainty seemed to loosen their grip all at once. Around the room, similar scenes unfolded quietly. No dramatic reactions. No speeches. Just women rediscovering something they had nearly forgotten. Normality. Water struck tile. Steam drifted upward. Towels waited on benches. The world did not change in a single moment. Yet Elsa sensed that something important was happening. Not because of the shower itself. Because of what it represented. Every story they had been told depended upon distance. Distance from reality. Distance from experience. Distance from actual people. Now reality stood directly in front of them. A corporal who respected privacy. A sergeant who treated prisoners with dignity. A camp that functioned according to rules rather than hatred. The picture was becoming more complicated. More human. More difficult to dismiss. Nearly an hour later, the women emerged into the evening air wearing fresh uniforms. The Oklahoma sky stretched overhead in shades of gold and deep blue. A cool breeze crossed the campgrounds. Elsa paused outside the building. The air smelled of grass and distant rain. Nearby, an American flag moved. Gently atop a tall pole. Beyond it stood rows of barracks, storage buildings, and gravel roads disappearing into the fading light. The camp looked peaceful. Not perfect. Not home. But peaceful. Lotte stepped beside her. "Do you think they are all like this?" she asked quietly. Elsa followed her gaze toward the rows of buildings. For a moment she considered all the stories they had carried across the ocean. Then she thought about the warm water. The clean towels. The closed door. "I do not know," Elsa said honestly. "But I think we are learning that not everything we were told was true." Neither woman spoke after that. They simply stood together beneath the Oklahoma sky as evening settled across Camp Rose. And for the first time since leaving Europe, Elsa felt the future become slightly less frightening than the past. The next morning arrived with the sound of wind moving through the prairie grass beyond the fences of Camp Rose. Elsa woke before sunrise. Years of hospital work had trained her body to rise early, long before alarms or schedules demanded it. For a moment she lay still in the narrow bunk, listening. The barracks were quiet except for the soft breathing of the other women. Pale light filtered through the windows. Somewhere outside, a screen door opened and closed. A truck engine started in the distance. Ordinary sounds. American sounds. She stared at the ceiling and realized something unusual. For the first time in many months, she had slept through the night. No sudden fears. No anxious dreams. No waking every hour to wonder what might happen next. The realization felt almost as surprising as the shower itself. When the women entered the mess hall shortly before 6 o'clock, the smell met them before the room did. Fresh coffee. Toast. Eggs cooking on a large metal griddle. The scent drifted through the air like a memory from another lifetime. Several women slowed their pace. One quietly shook her head in disbelief. Elsa could not blame her. During the final years of the war, meals had become calculations rather than experiences. People counted portions. Counted days. Counted whatever remained. Here, the smell alone seemed excessive. The mess hall was already busy. American personnel moved between tables carrying trays and coffee mugs. Some looked up briefly as the prisoners entered. Most simply continued their conversations. No one stared. No one pointed. No one appeared interested in creating discomfort. It was another small detail that refused to fit old assumptions. Elsa carried her tray toward an empty table. Scrambled eggs. Toast with butter. Oatmeal. A small apple. Coffee. Nothing extravagant. Yet she could not stop looking at it. Across from her, Lotte sat down and immediately smiled at the sight of the apple. "I almost forgot these existed," she said softly. Elsa laughed. The sound surprised both of them. It felt unfamiliar in her own throat. Nearby, another woman carefully folded her napkin before eating. Someone else stared into a cup of coffee as though trying to solve a puzzle hidden beneath the surface. Around the room, small fragments of humanity slowly returned. After breakfast, the women were escorted outside for orientation. The Oklahoma morning was cool and bright. Sunlight stretched across the gravel roads between buildings. The sky seemed impossibly large. Elsa had noticed that since arriving. America felt enormous. The land extended in every direction without interruption. Back home, villages and towns often felt connected by centuries of history. Here, the horizon itself seemed larger. Sergeant Thomas Miller stood near a wooden bulletin board holding a clipboard. He waited until the group assembled before speaking. "Good morning," he said. "Today you will receive work assignments, camp regulations, and information about available services." His tone remained calm and professional. Elsa found herself listening more carefully than before. Not because she trusted him completely. Because she no longer expected hidden threats beneath every sentence. Miller explained schedules, meal times, medical services, mail procedures, and educational programs available within the camp. Educational programs. That detail attracted immediate attention. Several women exchanged surprised looks. "Classes?" one asked. "Yes," Miller replied. "English instruction. Basic vocational courses. Library access." Library access. Elsa blinked. Beside her, Lotte appeared equally confused. Books were not something they had expected to discuss as prisoners. Miller continued speaking while the women listened in growing silence. Every new detail seemed to create another crack in the image they had carried across the ocean. Later that morning, Elsa reported to the camp infirmary after learning she had been assigned temporary nursing duties. The building was small but clean. Sunlight poured through large windows overlooking a patch of grass outside. Shelves contained medical supplies organized with careful precision. The familiar sight immediately settled something inside her. Medicine had always made sense to her. Illness did not care about nationality. Recovery did not care about politics. Human beings simply needed help. A civilian nurse named Margaret Collins greeted her near the entrance. She appeared to be in her 40s and wore round glasses that constantly slid down her nose. "You worked in hospitals before?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Elsa replied. "Several years." Margaret smiled. "Good. Then you already know where half the supplies are without looking." Elsa found herself smiling back. It was a small exchange. Nothing remarkable. Yet the simplicity of it lingered. They spent the morning organizing equipment, checking inventory, and preparing examination rooms. By noon, Elsa realized she had gone nearly 4 hours without thinking about fear. The realization stopped her completely. She stood beside a cabinet of bandages and stared out the window. Fear had become such a permanent companion that its absence felt noticeable. Not complete absence, but enough to recognize. Outside, a group of American workers crossed the yard carrying lumber toward a maintenance building. One of them paused to wave at someone across the camp. Another laughed at a joke Elsa could not hear. Life continued. Ordinary life. The same thing people everywhere wanted. During lunch, she sat beneath a tree near the infirmary and watched clouds drift across the enormous Oklahoma sky. A memory returned unexpectedly. Her father reading a newspaper at the kitchen table years earlier. Her mother tending flowers on a balcony. A summer afternoon before everything became complicated. The memory felt painful and comforting at the same time. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" a voice said. Elsa looked up. Sergeant Miller stood several feet away holding a coffee cup. She hesitated before answering. Yes, she said. It is. Miller nodded toward the horizon. Storm's coming tomorrow, according to the forecast. Elsa glanced at the clear blue sky. You can tell that already? Miller smiled slightly. Around here, people learn to watch the weather. For a moment neither spoke. Then Elsa asked the question that had quietly followed her since arrival. Why is everyone here so normal? Miller looked genuinely puzzled. Normal? Yes. He considered that. Because most people are just people, Miss Richter. The answer sounded almost disappointingly simple. Yet Elsa found herself thinking about it long after he walked away. Most people are just people. The sentence stayed with her throughout the afternoon. It followed her back to the barracks that evening. And as the sun disappeared beyond the Oklahoma prairie, she began to suspect that the greatest surprise waiting in America was not kindness itself. It was discovering how ordinary kindness could be when people chose it every day. Rain arrived the following afternoon exactly as Sergeant Miller had predicted. Dark clouds rolled across the Oklahoma sky shortly after lunch, covering the prairie in broad gray shadows. By 3 o'clock, steady rain tapped against the windows of the infirmary where Elsa spent most of her workday. The sound filled the building with a quiet rhythm. Patients rested. Nurses moved through hallways with practiced efficiency. Outside, the camp seemed softer beneath the falling water. Elsa stood near a window organizing medical records when she noticed something unusual. A line had formed outside a small building across the yard. Men and women moved in and out carrying books. Curious, she asked Margaret Collins about it. The older nurse glanced outside and smiled. The library, she said. Rainy days always bring people there. Elsa looked again. A library. The word still felt strange inside a prisoner camp. Later that evening, after her duties ended, she decided to see it for herself. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle by then. Water collected in shallow puddles along the gravel paths. The air smelled clean and cool. Elsa pulled her jacket tighter and crossed the yard. The library occupied a modest wooden building near the center of camp. Warm light glowed through its windows. When she stepped inside, she immediately noticed the silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. Shelves stretched across the room filled with books of every size and color. Several prisoners sat reading at long tables. American staff worked quietly behind a desk near the entrance. Nobody seemed surprised to see her. Nobody appeared concerned by her presence. It was simply another evening in the library. Elsa walked slowly between the shelves. History. Literature. Science. Dictionaries. Medical texts. The collection was larger than she expected. She stopped when she noticed a familiar title translated into English. A book she had studied years earlier during nursing school. Without thinking, she pulled it from the shelf. The weight of it felt reassuring in her hands. Knowledge had always felt safe. Reliable. Unlike politics. Unlike rumors. Unlike fear. A voice interrupted her thoughts. You found something useful. Elsa turned. Sergeant Miller stood several feet away holding a book of his own. He looked almost different without a clipboard. Less like an authority figure. More like an ordinary man visiting a library after work. I was surprised this place exists, Elsa admitted. Miller glanced around the room. Why? Because libraries are usually built for the future. He considered that for a moment. Maybe that is exactly why this one exists. The answer lingered in Elsa's thoughts. Libraries were built for the future. Not the past. Not the mistakes people carried with them. The future. She looked around the room again. Prisoners and Americans sat beneath the same roof reading the same books while rain tapped softly against the windows. The scene would have seemed impossible only a few months earlier. Yet here it was. Real. Unremarkable. Ordinary. They spoke for a few more Minutes about books. Nothing political. Nothing dramatic. Just books. Before leaving, Miller recommended a novel written by an American author. Elsa promised she would look for it. When he walked away, she realized she had just spent 10 minutes talking to an American sergeant without feeling afraid. The realization unsettled her more than fear itself once had. Change often arrived quietly. Days passed. Then weeks. Camp Rose settled into routine. Elsa worked mornings at the infirmary. Afternoons were often spent studying English or reading in the library. The women who had arrived terrified and uncertain gradually began building small lives within the structure of camp life. Lotte joined an English class and discovered she had a talent for languages. Another woman helped organize books in the library. Others worked in kitchens, offices, or maintenance assignments. The transformation happened slowly enough that nobody noticed it at first. Then one evening Elsa sat outside her barracks watching the sunset and realized she had not heard anyone repeat the old stories in weeks. The rumors. The warnings. The terrifying predictions that had crossed the ocean with them. They had faded away. Not because someone argued against them. Because reality had replaced them. A person can cling to fear only so long when confronted daily by evidence that contradicts it. The sunset that evening painted the clouds gold and orange. The prairie seemed endless beneath the fading light. Nearby, several women laughed over a card game. Their voices carried across the grass. Elsa watched them quietly. Months earlier, she would have believed such a scene impossible. Yet there it was. Human beings adapting. Recovering. Remembering how to be themselves again. She thought back to the hallway outside the shower room on her first night at Camp Rose. The fear. The silence. The certainty that something terrible waited beyond that door. It seemed like a memory from another life. The shower itself had been ordinary. Water. Soap. Towels. Nothing extraordinary. Yet that ordinary moment had opened a crack in a wall built over years. And once that crack appeared, truth found its way through. Not all at once. Slowly. Patiently. Day after day. Like sunlight entering a dark room through a window someone forgot to cover. Elsa looked toward the horizon where the last light of day still lingered above the Oklahoma plains. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something stronger than relief. She felt possibility. And possibility, she was beginning to learn, could be more powerful than fear. Autumn arrived quietly at Camp Rose. The Oklahoma heat softened. Mornings carried a crisp edge that reminded Elsa of Northern Europe. The prairie grass shifted from bright green to shades of gold, and the sky seemed even larger than before. Life settled into patterns so predictable that entire days sometimes passed without surprise. Elsa worked at the infirmary, attended English classes in the evenings, and spent spare hours in the library. It was a simple routine, yet simplicity itself felt like a gift. One October morning, Margaret Collins handed Elsa a stack of medical forms and smiled. "You know," she said, adjusting her glasses, "half the staff asks for you by name now." Elsa looked up from the paperwork. "Why?" Margaret laughed softly. "Because you are good at what you do." The answer seemed obvious to Margaret. To Elsa, it felt unfamiliar. During the war, people had been reduced to categories. Uniforms. Nationalities. Sides. Here, Margaret appeared to judge people by entirely different measurements. Reliability. Skill. Character. The distinction mattered more than Elsa wanted to admit. Later that week, the infirmary received several local children for routine examinations organized through a community health program. The nearest town was small, and medical resources were limited. Elsa spent the afternoon helping record information and organize supplies. One little boy, no older than 8, stared at her accent with open curiosity. "Where are you from?" he finally asked. His mother looked embarrassed. "Tommy," she whispered. Elsa smiled before the woman could apologize. Germany. The boy considered this carefully. That is far away. Yes, Elsa replied. Very far away. He nodded as if this solved everything. Then he returned to studying the jar of tongue. Depressors on the counter. Elsa found herself smiling long after he left. Children often saw the world more clearly than adults. To the boy, she was not a prisoner. Not an enemy. Not a symbol of anything. She was simply a woman from a place far away. One evening after work, Elsa visited the library to return a novel Sergeant Miller had recommended. The building was nearly empty. Rain tapped gently against the windows while a small lamp glowed beside the circulation desk. As she placed the book on the counter, she noticed a bulletin board covered with photographs. Camp activities. Educational classes. Gardening projects. Community events. One photograph caught her attention. It showed a group of prisoners and American staff standing together beside a newly planted vegetable garden. Everyone was smiling. Elsa stared at the image for several seconds. Months earlier, she would have dismissed such a photograph as staged propaganda. Now she recognized many of the faces. The smiles were real. The friendships were real. The ordinary humanity was real. Sergeant Miller appeared beside her unexpectedly. Interesting picture? He asked. Elsa nodded. If someone had shown me this a year ago, I would never have believed it. Miller studied the photograph. A lot of people would not. Why? He leaned against the wall thoughtfully. Because people usually imagine strangers before they meet them. And imagination is often worse than reality. Elsa looked at the photograph again. She thought about the journey across the Atlantic. The rumors. The certainty. The fear. Entire worlds had been built from imagination. Entire assumptions. Entire hatreds. Yet all of them had begun collapsing the moment reality entered the room. The realization followed her back to the barracks that night. As winter approached, Camp Rose prepared for colder weather. Additional blankets appeared in the barracks. Maintenance crews checked heating systems. The library displayed holiday decorations near the entrance. Small changes. Ordinary changes. Signs that life continued moving forward. One evening, Lotte joined Elsa on a bench outside the barracks. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere. Beyond the camp. Stars filled the Oklahoma sky from horizon to horizon. Do you remember our first night here? Lotte asked. Elsa laughed softly. I remember every minute of it. I thought the worst was about to happen. So did I. Lotte looked toward the distant lights of the camp. Now I cannot believe how frightened we were. Elsa remained quiet for a moment. Fear feels convincing when it is all you know. The younger woman nodded. Neither spoke after that. They simply watched the stars. The silence between them felt comfortable. Peaceful. The kind of silence people share when they no longer need to explain themselves. As the weeks passed, Elsa noticed something else changing inside her. She no longer thought of Camp Rose as a temporary interruption. It had become part of her story. Not because it was perfect. No place was. But because it had forced her to confront something she had never expected. The possibility that people could be different from what they were told to fear. One cold December morning, she arrived at the infirmary before sunrise. Frost covered the grass outside. The world seemed painted silver beneath the early light. She paused at the entrance and looked across the camp. Smoke rose from chimneys. A truck moved slowly along the main road. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang to signal breakfast preparations. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary sights. Yet they carried extraordinary meaning. Because months earlier she had expected cruelty and discovered routine. She had expected humiliation and discovered dignity. She had expected enemies and discovered people. Standing there in the cold morning air, Elsa finally understood why that first evening remained so vivid in her memory. It was never really about water. It was never really about soap or towels or a closed door. It was about the moment reality became stronger than fear. And once that happened, everything else began to change. Christmas approached Camp Rose with a quiet kind of anticipation. Decorations appeared gradually, one small detail at a time. A paper wreath hung near the library entrance. Strings of colored lights appeared around the mess hall windows. Someone placed a small evergreen tree in the administrative building lobby. None of it was elaborate. Yet to Elsa, the decorations felt almost miraculous. For years, every holiday had seemed overshadowed by uncertainty. Now, for the first time in a long while, people were preparing for a celebration rather than simply enduring another season. The Oklahoma winter remained mild compared to Northern Europe. Frost covered the ground on some mornings, but by afternoon the sun often returned, warming the camp roads and wooden buildings. One afternoon, Elsa left the infirmary carrying a stack of reports and noticed several American workers unloading boxes near the mess hall. Curious, she asked Margaret Collins what was happening. "Holiday supplies," Margaret said. "Every year we try to make things a little brighter." Elsa looked toward the boxes. "Even here?" Margaret adjusted her glasses and smiled. "Especially here." The answer stayed with Elsa for the rest of the day. Especially here. That evening, she sat in the library reading beside a window while wind rattled the glass softly. Across the room, several prisoners practiced English vocabulary. An American volunteer moved from table to table helping with pronunciation. Laughter occasionally interrupted the lesson. Elsa looked around and realized how familiar the room had become. Months earlier she had entered the library with caution. Now it felt almost like a second home. A place where people gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a display near the entrance. At first glance it appeared to be an ordinary bulletin board. Then she realized it contained handwritten holiday messages. Camp staff and prisoners had been invited to write hopes for the coming year. Elsa stopped and read several notes. "Good health for my family. Safe travels home. A successful harvest. Peace." The word appeared again and again. Peace. Written in different handwriting. Different styles. Different languages. Yet always the same word. She stood there for several moments before finally taking a blank card from the basket beneath the display. Her pencil hovered above the paper. For a while she could not think of what to write. Then she wrote 3 simple words. More understanding. She pinned the card to the board and stepped back. The message seemed small compared to everything that had happened. Yet it felt honest. The following week, Camp Rose held a modest holiday gathering in the mess hall. Long tables were decorated with evergreen branches and simple centerpieces. The kitchen staff worked for days preparing food. When the prisoners entered that evening, conversations immediately quieted. The room looked completely different. Warm lights glowed overhead. Music played softly from a radio near the far wall. The smell of roasted turkey, bread, vegetables, and pie filled the air. Elsa stopped in the doorway. Around her, several women did the same. Not because of the food. Because of the effort. Someone had decided they were worth preparing this for. Someone had chosen generosity when indifference would have been easier. Latte leaned closer and whispered, "I do not know what to say." Elsa understood perfectly. Some moments could not be explained. They could only be experienced. During the meal, conversations flowed easily between tables. People discussed books, weather, hometowns, and future plans. Elsa found herself seated across from Sergeant Miller. At one point he glanced around the crowded room and smiled. "Quite a difference from your first night here." Elsa laughed softly. "That may be the understatement of the year." Miller nodded. "Fair enough." For a moment they both looked around the room. American staff. German prisoners. Nurses. Clerks. Teachers. Mechanics. People who had once existed only as distant ideas to one another now shared stories over dinner. The scene seemed almost impossible. Yet there it was. Real enough to touch. Later that evening, after the gathering ended, Elsa stepped outside. The air was cold but clear. Stars stretched across the Oklahoma sky like scattered diamonds. The camp behind her glowed with warm light. She stood quietly with her hands in her coat pockets. A year earlier she would never have imagined standing beneath an American sky feeling grateful. Yet gratitude was exactly what she felt. Not because life was perfect. Not because every question had been answered. But because she had learned something important. Human beings were often far more complicated than the stories told about them. The realization felt both humbling and hopeful. Footsteps approached behind her. It was Latte. The younger woman looked toward the stars and smiled. "Do you think we will remember this place years from now?" she asked. Elsa did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the distant library, the infirmary, the mess hall, and finally toward the building where months earlier a simple door had changed everything. "Yes," she said at last. "I think we will remember it for the rest of our lives." January brought clear skies and cold mornings to Camp Rose. The holiday decorations disappeared one by one, packed carefully into storage boxes until another year. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet something had changed beneath the routine. The camp no longer felt like a place suspended between past and future. It felt like a community moving forward together, even if the people inside it came from different worlds. Elsa noticed the change most clearly in the infirmary. Patients no longer looked at her with curiosity when they heard her accent. New arrivals rarely asked where she was from. They asked about appointments, medications, schedules, and ordinary concerns. It was a small thing. Yet small things often revealed larger truths. One snowy morning, a thin layer of frost covered the camp roads. Elsa arrived early and found Margaret Collins standing outside the infirmary holding 2 cups of coffee. Steam drifted upward into the cold air. Margaret handed 1 cup to her without a word. They stood quietly for a moment watching the sunrise spread across the Oklahoma horizon. The sky turned pale gold above the prairie. "Beautiful morning," Margaret said. Elsa nodded. "Very beautiful." Margaret smiled. "You sound more like an Oklahoman every day." Elsa laughed softly. "I do not think that is possible." "Maybe not," Margaret replied. "But you seem more at home." The comment stayed with Elsa long after they went inside. At home. It was a complicated phrase. Camp Rose was not her home. Germany was still her home. The streets where she had grown up. The apartment where her mother once kept flowers on the windowsill. The river she crossed on her way to school. Those places belonged to her history. Yet Margaret had not been speaking about geography. She had been speaking about belonging. About feeling safe enough to breathe normally. Safe enough to trust what she saw. Safe enough to imagine tomorrow. One afternoon, while organizing medical supplies, Elsa received a letter from Europe. Mail deliveries always attracted attention throughout the camp. Letters carried entire worlds inside thin envelopes. She sat near a window and carefully unfolded the paper. The letter came from an old friend who had survived the war and returned to Bremen. Streets were being repaired. Businesses were reopening. Families were trying to rebuild lives piece by piece. The city remained scarred, but people were moving forward. Elsa read the letter twice. Then a third time. The words filled her with relief and sadness simultaneously. Home still existed. Yet it had changed. Just as she had changed. Later that evening, she walked to the library carrying the letter in her coat pocket. The building was quiet except for the turning of pages and the soft ticking of a wall clock. She found a seat beside the window and stared out at the camp lights glowing against the dark prairie. The future suddenly felt very close. Eventually prisoners would leave. Eventually everyone would return to lives beyond Camp Rose. The realization should have made her happy. Instead, it filled her with unexpected reflection. She thought about the first night. The hallway. The fear. The certainty that every story she had heard must be true. Then she looked around the library. A room filled with books, conversations, and ordinary human kindness. The distance between those two moments felt enormous. Yet less than a year had passed. Sergeant Miller appeared near the history section carrying a stack of returned books. He noticed her and walked over. "Good news?" he asked, glancing toward the letter. Elsa nodded. "A friend wrote from Bremen." "How is it?" She looked down at the folded paper. "Recovering. Slowly." Miller smiled. "Slow recovery is still recovery." Elsa considered that. The words applied to more than cities. They applied to people as well. Perhaps especially to people. Before leaving, she slipped the letter back into her pocket and stood near the bulletin board where she had once pinned a card with 3 simple words. "More understanding." The card remained there among dozens of others. Some had faded slightly. Some had curled at the edges. Yet the messages remained. Hope. Family. Peace. Opportunity. Understanding. She stared at them for a long moment. Then she realized something. Months earlier those words would have sounded idealistic. Abstract. Almost naive. Now they felt practical. Necessary. The kind of things ordinary people needed if they wanted a better future than the past they had inherited. Outside, the night air felt cold and clean. Elsa walked slowly back toward the barracks. Camp Rose stretched quietly around her. The library. The infirmary. The mess hall. The gravel roads. The familiar lights shining through windows. None of it seemed extraordinary anymore. That was precisely what made it extraordinary. The greatest changes in her life had not arrived through grand speeches or dramatic events. They had arrived through ordinary moments repeated consistently over time. A respectful conversation. A shared meal. A library card. A cup of coffee. A closed door that offered privacy instead of fear. Piece by piece, those moments had rebuilt something she had not realized was broken. Not trust in a country. Not trust in an institution. Trust in the possibility that human beings could choose decency even after difficult times. As Elsa reached the barracks, she paused and looked once more across the camp. Snow glittered faintly beneath the lights. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie. The sound faded slowly into the night. She listened until it disappeared completely, then smiled and continued walking forward. Spring arrived in Oklahoma with fields of green stretching beyond the fences of Camp Rose. The cold mornings faded. Trees began to bloom. Birds returned to the prairie. Life moved forward with quiet determination, carrying everyone with it. By April, rumors about repatriation had become more frequent. Official notices appeared. Administrative meetings increased. Lists were reviewed and revised. For the prisoners, the future was no longer an abstract idea. It was approaching. Elsa felt it in small moments. The way conversations lingered after dinner. The way people paused to appreciate ordinary routines. The way everyone seemed to be looking both forward and backward at the same time. One afternoon, she stood beside a window in the infirmary organizing supplies when Margaret Collins entered carrying a folder. "Looks like your paperwork is finally moving," Margaret said. Elsa accepted the folder and glanced through the documents. Her return to Germany was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming real. For several seconds she simply stared at the pages. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked. Elsa considered the question carefully. "Happy," she said. Then she smiled slightly. "And sad?" Margaret nodded as though she had expected that answer. That usually means something mattered. The word stayed with Elsa long after the conversation ended. Something mattered. She spent the following weeks noticing details she had once overlooked. The sound of the library door opening every morning. The smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall before sunrise. The gravel crunching beneath her shoes on the walk to the infirmary. Ordinary things. Yet those ordinary things had become part of her life. One evening, shortly before her scheduled departure, Elsa visited the library for what she knew might be the last time. The building looked exactly as it always had. Rows of books. Warm light. Quiet conversations. Nothing had changed. Yet everything felt different. She wandered slowly between the shelves, running her fingers along familiar book spines. Near the entrance, she stopped in front of the bulletin board. Many of the old cards remained pinned there. Some were faded. Some had been replaced. Her own card still hung among them. More understanding. She smiled when she saw it. Months earlier she had written those words without realizing how important they would become. A voice interrupted her. Thoughts? I had a feeling I would find you here. Elsa turned. Sergeant Thomas Miller stood beside a shelf of history books. He looked older somehow than when she had first met him. Not because time had passed. Because she actually knew him now. He was no longer a uniform. No longer a symbol. Just a person. I wanted to say goodbye, he said. Elsa nodded. So did I. For a few moments they walked slowly through the library. Neither seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Finally Miller stopped beside a table near the window. Do you remember the first night? He asked. Elsa laughed softly. I remember all of it. You looked ready to face an army. I thought I might have to. Miller smiled. Then his expression grew thoughtful. I always wondered what changed your mind. Elsa looked toward the window where sunlight spilled across the wooden floor. Beyond the glass, the prairie stretched toward the horizon. Not one thing, she said. Many things. She thought about the warm water. The clean towel. The books. The conversations. The coffee shared on cold mornings. The respect shown in 100 small ways. The truth usually arrives a little at a time, she said. Miller nodded slowly. I think that is true. When they reached the entrance, he extended his hand. Elsa accepted it. The gesture was simple. Ordinary. Yet it carried the weight of everything that had happened between that first fearful evening and this final day. Good luck, Miss Richter, he said. Thank you, Sergeant. Thomas, he corrected gently. Elsa smiled. Thank you, Thomas. A few weeks later, the train carrying Elsa away from Camp Rose rolled across the Oklahoma prairie beneath a bright blue sky. She sat beside the window watching the landscape pass. Fields. Farmhouses. Telephone poles. Small towns. The same America she had once approached with fear now drifted by with a strange sense of familiarity. In her bag rested a few books, several letters, and a small wrapped bar of soap she had saved since her first week at the camp. Not because of the soap itself. Because of what it represented. Years later, living once again in Germany, Elsa would tell her grandchildren about many things. She would tell them about the war. About rebuilding. About loss and recovery. But sometimes she would tell a different story. A quieter story. The story of arriving in a place she feared. The story of discovering that reality could be kinder than rumor. The story of how dignity often appeared in the smallest actions. And whenever her grandchildren asked when everything began to change, Elsa would smile and remember a wooden door beneath yellow hallway lights in Oklahoma. She would remember warm water, a clean towel, and the unexpected gift of privacy. Then she would tell them something she had learned over the course of that remarkable year. Fear grows in the dark when people never meet. Understanding begins the moment they do. And sometimes the most important changes in a human life arrive not through grand events, but through ordinary acts of decency repeated day after day. The people at Camp Rose never asked her to forget where she came from. They never asked her to abandon her memories. They simply treated her like a human being. In the end, that was enough. The prairie disappeared behind the train. The years continued forward. Yet the lesson remained. She did not learn it from a speech. She learned it from a closed door, a quiet room, and people who chose kindness when they could have chosen something else. And that lesson stayed with her for the rest of her life.